Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Arts and Design Fridays. We're delighted to have Barnali Ghosh today as our guest speaker. My name is Susan Moffett. I'm Creative Director of Future Histories Lab here at Berkeley and Executive Director of the Global Urban Humanities Initiative. And this class is called Humanities 20, Explorations in Art and Design at Berkeley. And it's also a public speaker series, so I want to give a warm welcome to our public audience here at the Osher Theater at BAMFA, and also to our Zoom audience as well. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that this talk today is part of a larger Friday speaker series called Landscapes of Migration, Incarceration, and Resistance. And that is in further part of the year-long project called A Year on Angel Island. And Lisa Wymore from the Arts and Design Initiative and I, on behalf of Future Histories Lab, have, with many partners and many contributors, put together a year of programming that includes performances, exhibitions, public speakers, creative projects, and courses. And all of these have public aspects to them. And if you're interested in learning more about them, you can go to our website, futurehistories.berkeley.edu. You can sign up for our newsletter, and you can look up the events and opportunities for engagement that are there. So that is A Year on Angel Island. And I want to go over a few housekeeping things with our students in this Humanities 20 class. And let's see, I want to let folks know, students, that we have a couple of slots left for our October 15th field trip to Angel Island. And if you are interested in going, please email through B Courses Shelby Kendrick. She's in the people section. You can email her, and she can let you know whether there are still spaces available for that October 15th field trip. Second, I want to remind folks, especially those of you who are doing the explorations assignment here at the Undoing Time Art and Histories of Incarceration exhibition here at BAMFA, which is a fantastic exhibition. Wednesdays and Sundays, there are guided tours led by students who are part of the Underground Scholars program. And Underground Scholars is a fantastic program here at Berkeley that supports students who either have been previously incarcerated themselves or whose lives have been touched by incarceration. So walking through that exhibition with folks who have a direct connection to the themes of what the artists are addressing there, I think would be a really meaningful experience for everyone. And those tours are also open to the public. So the public, you can just go to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive website, and you can find the information on the exhibition and the tours there. I also want to let students know that if for your final assignment for the semester, and I know that may seem a long way away, but if you're interested in researching your own family history or doing the archival research option, for that final assignment, I encourage you to come to my office hours, which are Wednesdays from 1:30 to 2:30, so I can help you get started on that. As we explain in B courses, because this is just a one-unit class, we're not asking you to do a really big research project that is finished, but we invite you to just start the process of digging into the National Archives at San Bruno or other digital archives that are available. It's really quite inspiring to touch or to look at some of these old immigration documents, genuine, original documents. And it's quite an experience. And so if you're interested in doing that, it's best to get started early because you have to apply to go to the archives and so on. So come and talk to me if you're interested in doing that. And I'll connect you with librarians who are really expert in doing that kind of work. About attendance and assignments, I want to remind folks that if you have questions about the assignments, if you want to have an excused absence because you are ill, please contact Adiola and Lauren, who are the course readers. Don't email me about it because they are the ones marking you absent or present and marking your assignments on time or late. So please remember that they are the ones that you should contact. That information is in the syllabus. And also you can find Adiola and Lauren in the in the people section of B courses. I also just want to remind folks that next week we have a really exciting talk by UC Berkeley professor Catherine Sinisa Choi about her new book, which is Asian American Histories of the United States. And that's going to be a really great talk, so I encourage you to come and to bring your friends as well. Okay, so now I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, Barnali Ghosh, and I want to start our session with an acknowledgement that where we are here in Berkeley, we are in the territory of Huichin, which is the unceded homeland and current home of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, and also the place that is our object of study, our jumping off point this semester, and for the whole year, Angel Island, is the territory of the Coast Miwok people. And Barnali has thought a lot as an immigrant about her journey here into these territories and what it means for any of us to come to this place. And so I'm looking forward to listening to her talk kind of in that context as well. So far this semester, we've been thinking about immigration, incarceration, othering, and belonging through the lenses of theater and dance, and of visual arts, painting, architectural history. And today we're going to think about walking as a method of investigation, walking as a method of storytelling, walking fast and slow, and to think about what we learn or don't learn as we walk down the street, walk through Sproul Plaza, take a hike on Angel Island. What are the stories that are hidden in the landscape, and what are the stories that are celebrated? Barnali Ghosh, with her partner Anirvan Chatterjee, have created an incredible experience called the Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour. And that's a long string of words that a lot of people don't necessarily think of as going together. But Berkeley does have a South Asian history that's important, not just locally, but globally. And when I first took this tour, I was really fascinated to learn that history. And thousands of people have flocked to this tour. It's available to the public. You can go to their website and take it if you like. I think you'll be inspired after hearing Barnali today. Barnali's work has really inspired a lot of our work in the program that I run, which is called Future Histories Lab. We're very focused on place-based storytelling, and these kinds of walking tours are a big inspiration to us. Barnali also works in the realm of visual arts, and we'll be seeing a lot of that today. And she's a creator and a mover and shaker in many realms. And aside from the stuff that we're going to hear about today, which is kind of her creative and storytelling and activist practice, I want to let you know that Barnali also has some really hardcore nuts and bolts, kind of project management, policy, design chops that she puts to good use. So she's an artist who also engages at a very pragmatic and practical level with what goes on every day in our democracy. She serves both on the Planning Commission and the Transportation and Infrastructure Commission in Berkeley. She brings her knowledge. She has a master's in landscape architecture from UC Berkeley College of Environmental Design, which is also my alma mater. And so she's doing this really hard work that goes on in every municipality. And I encourage students, if you have a chance to go to a Berkeley City Council meeting or a Planning Commission or Transportation meeting, this is where democracy happens. And activism engagement is not just going to a protest, not just sharing memes. It's reading the staff reports. It's following an issue month after month, year after year. That's how things get done. And I'm very grateful to people like Barnali who do that work. I know how hard it is because I've served on commissions myself. And I just encourage you to learn about that world. Barnali also served on the board of Transform, which is a very effective Bay Area organization advocating for equitable transportation and land use. And she had a very important role in that organization that advocates for transportation alternatives. Barnali has worked also as a practicing landscape architect, organizing large teams to make public spaces and parks. And in a very different realm, she was for a number of years a producer and performer in Yoni Ki Baat, which is the South Asian version of Eve Ensler's Vagina Monologues, with original writing by South Asian women. And Yoni Ki Baat, in each iteration, brought together a dozen women to create a community-based production around true stories of women's experiences from the South Asian diaspora. So it's hard to find someone with as varied a background as Barnali. She's also a gifted teacher who has taught in various ways at the College of Environmental Design. And we first met when we were both teachers in a program at the UC Berkeley College of Environmental Design that brought 300 teenagers from Japan who had just lived through the tsunami and the nuclear disaster in 2011 in northeastern Japan. We were teaching in a fantastic program called Y Plan, and I encourage students to Google that. Look for Berkeley Y, the letter Y hyphen plan, which teaches city planning and leadership to high school students, largely here in the US, especially in underserved communities. But we also taught together these Japanese young students who had been through that trauma together. And I was really impressed by Barnali's creativity and also her leadership among us teachers. I was grateful for that at that time. I really remember that. And her compassion for the students and for all of us. So I'm so excited to have Barnali here to share her work. And so please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Barnali Ghosh.
Thank you, Susan, for that generous introduction. And sometimes I feel bad doing all these different things because my intro always takes longer than most people. Give me a second to transition to my presentation and I'll get started. I'm gonna start with a presentation about the walking tour. I do it with my husband Anirvan, so it's kind of a family thing. The walking tour is our baby. It just turned 10. I'm going to be sharing with you basically our secret family recipe of how we put the tour together. That should prepare you to go forward and do your own walking tours, which is something we're always excited about, is people learning and then, putting that into action in the real world. So I'm Barnali, and I'm one of the curators of the Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour, along with Anirvan Chatterjee, who we're also married. Sometimes that's awkward on the tour, but it is. I grew up in Bangalore in India, and I moved here in 1999 to study landscape architecture at Cal. And I practiced for about a decade designing public parks, schools, playgrounds, and streets. And like Susan mentioned, most of that work is now focused on walking, biking, public transit advocacy. I'm most engaged with the organization in Berkeley called Walk Bike Berkeley, and I'm on their coordinating committee. Anirvan grew up in the Bay Area, and he did his undergrad at Cal and works as a techie at UCSF. So through my presentation, I'm going to share some question prompts for you to sort of absorb what I'm saying, but also because I want to hear back from you when we take a little bit of a break between the two presentations. So the second half is going to be more of my personal story and the visual artwork. So we'll transition. And at that point, you feel free to reflect on some of these questions that I'm asking. So the first question is, what did you know of Berkeley before you came here for school? What do you know now about the city? So 50 years, for me, 50 years before the free speech movement, my adopted hometown of Berkeley, California, was home to a very different kind of political movement. In Berkeley, San Francisco, and up and down the west coast of the United States and Canada, Indian immigrants organized with a new movement called the Ghadar Party, fighting for a socially just and equitable world and freedom for India from the British Empire. So since 2012, we have been telling the story of the Ghadar Party and subsequent generations of South Asian American feminists, LGBTQ activists, youth organizers, and others on the monthly Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour. we bring radical immigrant histories alive on the streets of Berkeley using storytelling, visuals, street theater at some of the original locations. So we've run over 225 tours in 10 years, reaching over 3,000 people, ranging from fierce activists to the curious but apolitical. South Asian immigrants, and also folks who couldn't even identify South Asia on a map. So if you're wondering, South Asia, the region, when we think about the stories we share, are of folks with roots in countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, Burma, Bhutan, Afghanistan. We don't share stories from all of those places at every tour, but that's generally the world, part of the world that you should be thinking about. So how did we get started? In 2009, Anirvan and I left Berkeley for our year of no flying, a citizen journalism project where we interviewed folks impacted and or working on climate change. In order to draw attention to the high impacts of aviation, we also decided to see if we could travel without taking planes. We crossed oceans by container ship. We crossed continents on trains like those of the Trans-Siberian Express. We took buses and ferries and Amtrak across the US. And over the course of our year, we talked with over 60 people, including youth activists in Vietnam, landless peasants movements in Bangladesh, mothers of Chernobyl in Ukraine, and anti-aviation activists in the UK. We came back further motivated to work on climate and also with a personal mission to reduce non-essential plane trips. So Anirvan and I have both been activists and organizers in the community. Anirvan works with the Alliance of South Asians Taking Action, or ASATA, and I got started with Asha for Education, an organization that was founded right here at UC Berkeley. And we saw around us, especially in the South Asian community, amazing organizers, though many, including us, were on the edge of burnout. We knew that we needed to bring more people into our movements. But it's okay to laugh, folks. It's not all serious. Among South Asians, maybe in other communities, but definitely among South Asians, organizing is often seen as something that is not an acceptable path. We're one person at a family wedding, another at a protest. And this probably had a lot to do with the model minority lens that Asian Americans are often viewed with, and often view themselves by as well. At the same time, we were reading in books and meeting and hearing stories from older activists in the community that reminded us that fighting for equity and justice was part of our tradition, right here in our adopted homeland. As we dug further, we found more stories like those of the anti-colonial Ghadar Party with its headquarters right here in San Francisco, whose members lived in Berkeley. And in Berkeley, they were trying to overthrow the British Empire and meeting on campus and in places like Hotel Shattuck. We got so excited about these stories that we would often, when we were finding them out, we would go to a dinner party and we'd be like, "Did you know?" And people would be like, okay. Is this dinner party appropriate conversation? Anyway, it didn't go so well. So we knew that we had to create a format where we could do justice to these powerful histories and have folks opt in and give us their undivided attention. So another prompt before I move to the next part, which is, what is your community's relationship to activism? So during the year of no flying, we had taken a lot of walking tours. Some were really bad. They focused on trivia and inaccuracies. We loved the tours of street art in Berlin and the neighborhood tour by the Tenement Museum in New York. But the tour that influenced us the most was an 8-hour tour, walking tour that we took in Rome, organized by the Stalker Collective. We arrived at one of the old gates to join 60 or so Romans, many of whom kindly translated for us because this tour was for locals. We started by visiting the only Roman neighborhood that had been massively bombed by the Allies during World War II and learned about its history in a barber shop. We would visit a cemetery, an official and unofficial Roma camp. We would visit a failed train tunnel project, walk by the Tiber and through farmlands. We loved that the tour was for locals, And it showed us a side of Rome of today that is invisible to many who pass through only the Colosseum and the Sistine Chapel. So another prompt: are there walking tours that you've taken that have inspired you? Why? So we both also love walking, so we decided that the walking tour format would be the most appropriate. And these were some of our goals: to challenge the dominant narrative of South Asian American identity, to tell a more inclusive story of Berkeley's radical history. And we knew that we needed to make this relevant to our experiences today. It was also important to us to use the tour to change the way that folks experience Berkeley. We wanted it to be a space where we could bring up nuanced conversations about organizing and find inspiration, and to use these stories and the funds to support the activism of the future, the activism of the present. So we're not fans in general of tours where we stop in front of a building and tour guides point out things and list facts. And we also had the challenge of not having much to point to in the first place. We knew we had to get creative. So we brought in our experience with doing theater and also techniques that we learned from social justice facilitators and trainers. We established a simple storytelling approach that focused on how a person felt versus just relating facts. And we made sure to make it personal, because it is. So one afternoon, we sat at Gregoire's in North Berkeley, and we started mapping out the spots on the tour. We would be doing our first tour for a group of young South Asians, ages 15 to 21, who would be coming to Berkeley for 5 days to attend a summer camp for emerging South Asian activists. We would spend the next 2 months writing out these stories, doing research, conducting oral history interviews, gathering documents and images to share. We then started putting together a script and further editing the list of stories. We decided that the tour needed to be 3 hours long. As long as it was shorter than a Bollywood movie, we were good. And if we wanted to do the stories justice and also have time for participants to interact. We started writing our script and discussing how we would tell each of these stories and how we would anchor them in a location. We knew that we had to tell a story that didn't just focus on the oppression, but inspired us with tactics and strategy, that was complex and nuanced, but not so intimidating so as to prevent folks from getting involved in organizing of their own. We also had to tell stories that revealed the complexity of the South Asian community, whether it's related to caste or region. We timed the stories, scouted locations and restrooms, very important, and did a couple of on-site rehearsals. We wanted to start close to where the camp was being held, which was at the Rose Garden Inn on Telegraph Avenue, and our closest spot was the Pacific Center, a LGBTQ community center. So on August 4th, 2012, we did our first tour for the group at base, and I was really nervous because young people tell you things as they are. But we got amazing feedback, and we were ready to share it with the world. I was nervous because us older folks have a lot of baggage. But then we got started, and we had to make some decisions. Were we going to charge for the tour? Where should the proceeds go? How would an LGBTQ center go down as a starting point? We decided to charge for tours because in our experience, folks didn't take free things as seriously. We kept students and senior prizes lower, and later on added a category for those who were in financial hardship. We decided that 15 was our ideal number because we found that 4 or 5 folks consistently dropped out, so chose to increase the number to 21. And we decided to stick with the location for practical purposes. And it also somehow made sense for how a radical walking tour should start. The tour that you see today hasn't changed much from being a non-linear journey through time and space, spanning over a century of South Asian activism in Berkeley and beyond. We always start with introductions, and that has evolved. We only a few years ago started asking folks their gender pronouns. We actually don't do a land acknowledgement, but we found ways to work that work for us to talk about indigenous folks as a living culture, people who are still part of our community. And we always end with asking folks what their favorite story or moment was. but we always make sure to let folks know in the beginning so we know that they know that it will be asked of them. We think that it makes people listen and try to remember the stories with that idea in mind. We planned for interactive moments all through the tour. We would actually have participants recreate a protest. We would do a vigil in front of a new location of a restaurant that had been owned by a labor trafficker. We would have folks read accounts from a post-9/11 document of hate incidents. Unfortunately, as our content has grown, we find that we have less time for some of the audience readings, but we've worked to keep just enough in the slide. In the tour. We do written comment cards because we find that some people are good with verbal feedback and some with written feedback, and the card becomes a document for us. So one of our most potent tools is street theater. And one of our most powerful stories is about a young anti-colonial activist and poet, Kartar Singh Sarabha. Anirvan plays the role of Sarabha and shares his experiences of racism upon arriving in the US and helping build the Ghadar Party, writing poetry, publishing a revolutionary newspaper that would mobilize thousands around the world. Sarabha would eventually return to India to be part of an armed revolt against the British, but then would be captured and hung to death in India at the age of 19. So the walking tour has become a platform to support other projects. We've raised over $45,000 over the years to support projects like Bay Area Solidarity Summer, the Sikh American History Project, the South Asian American Digital Archive. And we've been able to connect folks to organizations doing the work today. So far, we've curated 2 art shows. Our Name is Rebel in Berkeley at Gorilla Cafe, and also Rebel Legacy in Oakland, focusing on these histories and on current issues and organizing in the South Asian community. And probably one of the most significant outcomes of doing this tour has been the naming of a street in Berkeley for one of the earliest South Asian immigrants to the US, Kala Bagai. Has anybody seen Kala Bagai Way? It's just down the street from here, like the next block. So over 100 years ago, Kala Bagai, her husband, and their 3 kids would arrive in Berkeley to move into their house, only to be shut out by their white neighbors. We shared the story of Kala Bagai on the tour, but it's important to note that they would go on to make a life somewhere else. Kala would survive many other traumas, including the death of her husband. Now, the naming of the street allows us as a city to give her the welcome she deserved. And we are now able to tell her story on the walking tour. And we finally have something to point to, the history that was invisible to us until now. I want to end this part of the presentation with an excerpt from a letter of support that was a really significant moment for me during this campaign. This is a letter from Karina Gold, who's the tribal chair of the Lejan Ohlone, the original people of this land. In the letter, she writes, when the opportunity to participate in the Shattuck Avenue name change came up, the tribe wholeheartedly supported the name change to Kala Bagai Way because we want to acknowledge that there have been and continue to be people who come to our territory who have faced and resisted oppression and whose stories should be lifted up and remembered. The history of Kala Bagai might not be told or acknowledged if we didn't offer this opportunity. Now, for me, much of this work is about creating a sense of belonging for myself and our communities. And for me, I've never felt more welcome or felt that I had a right to the city than when I read this letter. And with that, I'm going to stop. We're going to do a few questions, maybe take a couple of reflections, and then move on to the next half of the presentation.
Thank you, Barnali. That was great. And I really appreciate the way that you told us not just the stories within the tour, but the how of the tour, which is a lot of what we've been working on in Future Histories Lab to ask the questions of how things are made. I invite anyone who has a question at this point to think about it. And as I'm asking my question, feel free to raise your hand or to any reactions you have to Barnali's talk. We'd love to hear those too as well. But the question I have is that you mentioned, so many walking tours tend to start with the place. Like here's important building A and important building B. And you instead started with the stories and then had to figure out the right place to tell the stories. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process and how, when you were walking around Berkeley, around these streets that we all walk, how did you think about like where to tell the stories that you knew were the important stories?
Yeah, I think as I was saying, we don't have many places to point to. Uh, and for us, the collection of stories is as important as each individual story, because it really is kind of a play that you're experiencing on the streets, and each act is important in building towards the full narrative. And so that's kind of how we started. What are the stories we needed to tell that would help us tell this complex history of South Asians here? Very quickly, we realized it couldn't be chronological, so that was gone. If you're walking, that's quite difficult. I think one of the beautiful things about not having like a place to point to, which often happens because our communities are segregated into these spaces, right? And then we make something beautiful there, and then we get to maybe claim it. Because of the way immigration of South Asians happened, and also that we were never segregated into any physical locations, our histories are all over the city. The beautiful thing about that is our histories are often layered on to the same place, which means that you are engaging and interacting with the stories of other communities and people. So with the Pacific Center, that's an important place for lots of different communities, but also for the South Asian community, because that's where we tell the story of the founding of Trikon, which was the first South Asian LGBTQ organization anywhere in the world, right? So it's wonderful to not see our stories and our lives as so separate, but really recognize that they're layered. And focusing on the stories helps us to then find the place that allows us to do that, I think.
And you mentioned that South Asians were not segregated into ghettos within Berkeley, but they were not necessarily welcomed everywhere either. And I wonder, since our focus this year is on Angel Island, I know Kala Bagai's family came through Angel Island.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit more about her family's story and their connection to Angel Island as well as to Berkeley?
Right. I think when we think of Angel Island, we don't often think of the South Asian experience, mostly because the numbers, I think, are smaller. But Kartar Singh Sarabha, the young activist we talked about, who organized against the British Empire, did pass through Angel Island as well. He was detained there for 3 days. And of course, when you don't know how long you're being detained there, each day is very long. Even that experience, though, at Angel Island, from what we know from community folks, was radicalizing for him. Because many people were still coming here thinking this was the land of freedom. This was a place that had overthrown the British Empire, and then quickly complete that thing being shattered when you're detained at Angel Island, right? Similarly, Kala Bagai's family had a slightly different experience because they were coming with some wealth. So they were stuck on they were taken to Angel Island. They did spend about, I think, a weekend there because everything shuts down over the weekend. So they couldn't actually come onto the mainland. So their experience is a little bit different. But then that sort of positive outlook of like, I'm coming to America, we're escaping British colonialism, we're going to make a new life for ourselves here, we've sold our belongings, we're here, Vaishnav Das Bagai, her husband, they have 3 kids, and they're trying to make a life for themselves in San Francisco. And then if you come on the tour, you learn that this area of Berkeley, downtown Berkeley, was sort of a hub of South Asians living here and organizing here. There were like railroad workers down on Henry Street, for example. There was a person who worked as a servant who was living above McDonald's. There was the first astrologer in Berkeley, was like around this area. And Vaishnav Das Bagai had his first curio shop that he opened, like most immigrants. He opened a business as a way of making a life here, and that was just down this block on Center Street. So at some point, they decided that they wanted to move here to Berkeley. This is kind of where their friends lived. Some of it is speculation because our histories are not also written down in these very clean ways. And when they arrived at that house, Kala Bagai, in her oral history interview, recalls being shut out by the neighbors, by their white neighbors, and not being allowed to enter their house. And in that, she recalls telling Vaishnav that she did not want to live in this house or in this neighborhood because she was afraid that her neighbors might hurt their children. And for me, when I first heard that oral history on the South Asian Digital Archive in her own words, that was like in 2014, years before we even nominated Kala Bagai for this. But it really, made me think about my experience here. I had a really hard time finding housing, but also the Kala Bagais and the people who are trying to move to our city today, right? And do we make them feel welcome? And what do we lose when folks like her don't live in our city? Because she would go on to become this amazing community builder down in Southern California, and that was after her husband, who had gotten a citizenship in 1921, he would be stripped of his citizenship because of a Supreme Court case, a federal court case called the Bhagat Singh Thind case, and for 5 years he would fight that, and then eventually he would end up taking his own life in 1928. And then that would leave Kala. She would marry again. She would move to Southern California. She put her sons through college. And she would become like this person in the South Asian community in Southern California that was providing a welcome to immigrants, a kind of welcome that she never had. So, yeah.
Thanks. And I think that this story echoes kind of the precariousness of either the citizenship or the right to be here of Asians. We've learned a lot about people who, refugees who have been deported by ICE after incarceration in Lenora Lee's work, that this sense that even if you feel for a while that you belong here, it's often precarious. So before we move on to the rest of your presentation, do we have any other questions or responses to any of the prompts that Barnali provided? Okay, so we will move on now to the visual arts portion of Barnali's work, and then we'll have some more conversation and questions after that as well. So take it away, Barnali.
Thank you. Just have a sip of water before I get started. So this next one is more of a personal history. And with this one, feel free to react and respond. You can snap, you can laugh, that's all allowed. It would help me because this is only my second time doing this, and I'm a little nervous, which is good for a performer to be a little nervous, but I am a little nervous, so bear with me. I want to thank Susan because, I think with the walking tour, we're telling stories of other people, and they're amazing people. And you also realize how hard it is to tell your own story. And why that might be important for your own personal growth. So one day, a couple of months into the pandemic, I woke up like this. Well, not exactly. A few months into quarantine, I heard about the social media challenge called the Getty Museum Challenge, where folks were being asked to recreate artworks with things they had lying around the house. I was really intrigued by the idea, but I didn't want to recreate the old masters. I wanted to recreate South Asian artists, women artists. I wanted to recreate art that's found outside of museums. For me, these unfaithful recreations of these artworks were a response to the pandemic times we were living in. Over the course of the year, I would do 50 plus art recreations, and for me, they would become kind of a pandemic diary. So I used these recreations to respond to pandemic themes like the struggle to keep our home sanitized. I did a shout out to my parent friends who suddenly found themselves the sole caregivers of their children. I side-eyed folks who were not wearing masks or refusing to. And I tried to capture the anxiety of an essential worker stepping out into the city. I tried to capture all of the pandemic feelings of being isolated and stuck at home, of being exhausted, of missing friends. Those are all the lamps in my house. But I also used it to reflect on events that took on significance even during a pandemic. I mourned the loss of the Asian women who had been lost to anti-Asian hate in Atlanta. And I found inspiration in the renewed movement for Black lives in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And I tried to express the familiar feelings of being an immigrant far from home when a cyclone hit Kolkata. Now, through all of this, my face and my body were at the center of my art. I painted it, I taped it, I put it in all kinds of awkward positions. I attempted a nude. I just put some almost gone bananas to good use, and by now you know I'm not a baker, because otherwise these would be banana bread instead. Now, I did do a couple of recreations featuring baked goods, like this one with my dance friends Maureen and Girija, featuring this gorgeous sourdough by my friend Maureen. But mostly, I was putting toilet paper rolls on my head or contorting my body into awkward poses and risky positions that my husband Anirvan then had to photograph. Now, growing up as a girl in India, you're taught to hide your body, not center it. Years of street sexual harassment, or being told by family members that I was overweight or dark, or that my hair was not thick enough or long enough, all of that sort of had me hiding under layers of clothing. And if things weren't bad enough already, about a decade ago, I developed fibroids. And over the pandemic, they grew to a size that even clothing couldn't hide. And I started getting asked this question more frequently: are you pregnant? This is how I felt about being asked that question. This one is inspired by my friend Pallavi, who taught me that it's never okay to ask the question. Anyway, suddenly I couldn't just walk around without thinking of doing a recreation. So some folks here, you might remember the day of the orange sky. I woke up and I did Edward Hopper's Morning Sun. And then later that year, when I had to get major surgery to remove my fibroids, it meant cutting open my stomach. The next day at the hospital, I did American Gothic. Now, that should give you an idea of where my head was during the pandemic. So on the day that I got my vaccine, the first dose, I was so excited. I was feeling so positive. And I knew that, I had to mark this moment with the recreation. And I had an idea. And so when I came home, I put on my outfit, I did my makeup, and I set up my tripod, and I put the phone on it. I ran back. Oh, I set the 10-second timer. I ran back, struck a pose. Who's counting? Is it 10 seconds? Okay. Did I move too quickly? Set another timer, struck another pose. It was a hot April day, and I must have run like back and forth 10 times, 20 times, 30 times before I found the perfect pose to recreate the California poppy, our gorgeous state flower. I decided to post this to the California Native Plant Society Facebook group. I had lurked there for years. And I waited patiently, wondering if the moderators would approve this post of a brown woman cosplaying a native flower. And they did, and when they did, it got a huge response. Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. People were really excited about what I was doing. It happened to be California Native Plant Week, so I decided to do one a day. I did the lupin, whose petals turn from purple to pink when pollinated. These sweet baby blue eyes that I found just a few blocks from home. I did the Matiliha poppy, a flower that looks like a fried egg. I did the California peony, a flower that many people are surprised to even learn exists. And I loved recreating the complexity of the wild iris. And that is how I got started on my current series of self-portraits, where I recreate California native flowers using fabrics from South Asia and poses inspired by Odissi dance. So many of the saris that I use, they've sat in suitcases for decades. Some of them are from the time of my wedding. Others are gifts that were given to me over the years. And the most precious of them are saris that were given to me as a memory of a loved one who had passed. For me, the draping of the sari and then being able to fold it and put it away is like the blooming of flowers, and like many of our native wildflowers that grace us with their presence for only a moment in time. I did this globe lily with the first sari that I ever bought. I tried to capture its pinks and greens, its fuzzy white inside. Now, the photo of the globe lily was taken by Amy Patton, who works for the California Native Plant Society, and she's also an amazing photographer who I connected with on Instagram because of this project. She also took this gorgeous photo of the fairy slipper orchid. I used a sari that was given to my mom at the time of her wedding to create this California rose, and a sari that was given to my mom-in-law by her father to capture the forms and the feelings evoked by the California bleeding heart. Now, I moved here to the US over 2 decades ago to study landscape architecture. And when we were taught about California plants, folks would refer to plants, native plants that were here prior to European contact, but everything else would be called invasive or exotic. And for me as an immigrant, that language, those words felt really violent and felt nativist. And so even when I was learning about the importance of native plants to our biodiversity and the health of our ecosystems, that language felt othering. Now, over the years, the community has moved on to using language that's more specific, less othering. But these old words, these metaphors, they're powerful. And that's why I want to keep messing with them. When you take a photo in a sari and post it, you might be called exotic. But what does it mean when you're depicting a flower from a deeply indigenous ecosystem? For me, when I look at this photo, it's meant to delight, but I see at least 4 things that were completely transformed by historical colonialism. The handloom weaving of saris, Odissi dance, California indigenous landscapes, and the way my body is perceived in this country. For me, I'm trying to make connections between the impact that 300 years of colonialism had in my homeland and my journey here as an immigrant. The choices I made, the global structures I don't control, that have me now living here in Berkeley, California. How do we bloom where we're planted? What does it mean to feel like you belong to a place? How does it change your relationship to that place? For me, it allowed me to become a key part of the campaign to depolice traffic enforcement here in Berkeley, inspired by the movement for Black lives after the death of George Floyd. This was a campaign that got national attention and something we're continuing to push forward at the city. It allowed me to become a key organizer of the Kala Bagai Way campaign. Kala Bagai, who I mentioned, came to Berkeley, survived housing discrimination, survived federal discrimination, but went on to make her life for herself somewhere else. But finally, we're able to give her the welcome she deserved. For me, when I smell jasmine, I'm transported to the homeland. I want to change that. I want to add to that. I want to see our indigenous flowers and feel like I'm home. And this project is helping me do that. The bloom of the California poppy is resplendent, but the bloom is only half the story. It's its ability to put down roots that allows it to survive the most inhospitable conditions. When I started on these recreations, I did not know that it would allow me to find light on the darkest days of the pandemic, that it would set me on a journey of self-love and acceptance, that it would introduce me to so many special flowers. I did not know that it would help me find the cracks in the concrete, to put down roots and bloom. Thank you.
Thank you, Barnali. That was so beautiful. What I love about all your work is your ability to find beauty in complexity and not to oversimplify. And there's so much to talk about, and we'll go to questions and comments soon. So be thinking about what you might like to ask. But I just want to start with the idea of native plants, and you've talked about that. And I actually I'm a member of the Facebook group called on California native plants. And it's a huge group. It's thousands of people. It's very lively. And for those of you who are not kind of aware of the debate or the world of native plants, you know, California's landscape has been radically transformed by the introduction of plants from elsewhere. And the beautiful California hills that we see that are golden, they were not golden before Europeans came. It's the European grasses that go dry in summer that have replaced the native bunch grasses. So there are really good reasons to protect the native plants and those ecosystems. But sometimes this is very oversimplified, and there are kind of fundamentalists in the world of native plants who, if somebody posts about a weed, and a weed is any plant that we call a weed, right? A weed is defined as a plant that's somewhere you don't want it to be. They say, rip it out, get rid of it, it's invasive. And it is kind of violent language. And I'm just wondering, can you talk just a little bit more about how the plants helped you think about being non-native?
I mean, as I was saying, you know, when I went to school, that was like 20 years ago. And I think I haven't been able to put a finger on it until more recently about why that language felt that way. I just knew in my gut that it wasn't sitting well with me, I think. And I think part of it is because sometimes, like nature metaphors especially, can be really powerful, and they seep into other things, right? So sometimes nature metaphors might seep into conversations about immigration, especially when it comes to the description of, say, Asian Americans. Either you're exotic, you know, you're exoticized. We're very familiar, especially East Asian women, or even when we think about what happened with the murders in Atlanta, or you're sort of invasive and you're here to take our jobs, right? People can't really decide what it is. But I think the sort of seepage of this kind of language into other places makes it very dangerous as well for our communities, because then people are seen also as exotic and invasive. And plant people will tell you, and I believe it most of the time, that plants and people are different. We don't mean people when we're using these words. but not, I don't think everybody is able to make those separations. And so places where we talk about plants also become hostile because of that, right? So those communities can then be overly white and privileged. And what that means is, for me as a landscape architect who's interested in climate change, who's interested in understanding how our landscapes are going to heal, who's interested in engaging with that community, how do I do that when I step into a space and I might be perceived in a certain way? It's also important, to remember who's telling you that. It's not indigenous people calling you exotic or invasive. So I think so much of it is about that seepage and also how it keeps people out of these spaces. So it took, I think for me, I was in a really good mood that day as I was sharing, and I was like, oh, let me try just sharing this, see what happens. They're probably not gonna, hit accept, because so much of the conversation is about plant ID. But I think also because of the pandemic, people were online a lot, they were gardening a lot, and there was a hunger for things that were positive and joyful and delightful, and that would help sort of bridge our communities to come together and work on things together. And I think so much of my work is being okay with answering questions, with being that bridge, with trying to bring communities together and doing it in as positive a way as possible, but not hiding the dark stuff, right? So I think that's where my relationship with the flowers has helped do that. And personally, for me, it's completely transformed the way I walk the streets. To be able to know the names of flowers, it's like knowing the names of your friends, right? Indigenous people often will share that nature and things are our relatives. And now I kind of walk and I'm like, hey, I know you. I saw you bloom last year. Or where did this one go? Why did this gardener decide to change it out? Or who survived or who didn't? Trees have always been my favorite, like the buckeye on campus. Whenever I go there, I'm like, oh, hi, you're still alive, right? So I've always had that relationship with trees and remembering their names, but not with flowers. So, yeah.
Thanks. Do we have any questions or responses to what Barnali has been talking about today?
There's one in front here. And also, you can feel free to share, like, oh, I like that flower image. And, that's also great. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah. Well, this is a question from our Zoom audience, from Jean. It is, what is your favorite story to tell people about the walking tour?
Oh, as part of the walking tour?
This is about the walking tour?
Oh, about the walking tour.
Yeah.
Oh. That's a good question. Just reflect. I think one of the because we've been doing it for a decade now, I will say, we always say we do the tour rain or shine. And we did a tour during the bomb cyclone. Folks remember that? Where Strawberry Creek was like full. There was this huge rain event, and we still did a tour. So we hadn't had to cancel a tour because of rain, but we never imagined that we would have to cancel a tour because of heat. And I think the heat and the wildfires, right? This combination of air and heat is just something that we never thought we would cancel the tour for. So because we've been doing the tour for so long, it's also becoming like this climate diary of paying attention to like weather and temperature and how we sort of navigate the city. And the only other time we've canceled a tour has been when white supremacists came into town. Folks might remember. And our tour is a mixed audience, but very often it's brown folks standing in a street corner. And frankly, I didn't want to take the risk of brown folks standing in a street corner when white supremacists were coming to town. So we canceled the tour. But I think my other favorite things are the stories we tell. Some of them are of people in our community. They're living people. They continue to do organizing, and they've come as guests. People bike by, Tinku, whose story we tell first. Well, sometimes we're biking by, and people will be like, wait, isn't that the person whose picture we saw? So that's kind of sort of fun that the tour is integrated into the community, and it's telling stories of people who continue to live and work here.
So So I want to ask a little bit about that audience. And you describe the tour as something that is opt-in instead of, you're regaling people at dinner parties. But I wanted to ask, one stereotype of South Asians, especially in the Bay Area, is that of people in tech.
Right.
Tech bros in Patagonia who are just a little bit browner. And I'm wondering, do you have a lot of folks from that world on your tours? How do they react? What is the mix of people, and what are the different responses you get from within the South Asian community when they come on your tour?
So I think when we started the tour, it was meant for people who didn't know the stories. It wasn't meant for our activist friends. But initially, we had a lot of our folks in the South Asian community who were activists who were coming, partly because I think they needed to feel grounding. I think when Asian American people, we don't know our organizing history, we step into an organizing space, we're also looked at differently because of this model minority thing of not knowing your organizing history. People don't understand necessarily what your values are. But that being said, so with the activist folks coming, they were, bringing their parents or their siblings to explain to their parents and siblings, this is what we do. This is part of our tradition. So it became a place of comfort for them. But then, of course, we're interested in all kinds of people coming. And I think, including like techie folks, right? There is no Berkeley South Asian history tour. There's only a radical history tour. So if you're interested in South Asian history, this is what you're getting, which is great because then it brings people who might just be wanting the general history, but then what we're sharing with them is a way to get organized and engaged in the community. And I'll also say, I think there's this false dichotomy of like, if you're in tech, you can't do this. We have lots of friends who are techies, who are very engaged in social change and organizing. And also technology. What is technology? Like, that's just changed over the years, right? So gold panning was a kind of technology that changed California, right? So one of the things that I like in the way that tech has influenced how we conceptualized our tour is it's like, you just try out things. You don't have to wait for it to be perfect, for it to be in a theater, for every word to be written. It's a little more risk-taking in terms of when you put a project out. So you kind of model it and then you shift it as you go along. And that's very liberating, to not have to finish a piece and then put it out in the world. That can often take so long that there's some virtue of learning from techies who put stuff out as soon as they feel like it's ready. And it's a continuous iterating and repetition.
So one thing I'm curious about is that you have chosen not to use technology in your tour. It's very analog. You kind of show printed pictures and photos.
Right.
And one thing that we've been looking at in Future Histories Lab is new techniques and technologies. We had a course called Place-Based Storytelling, Techniques and Technologies. Yeah. And we looked at, there are very interesting tours. For example, there's a tour of the Fillmore district in San Francisco, a very interesting called Museum of the Hidden City. And the Black Liberation walking tour in West Oakland, which is mostly live, uses a little bit of recorded sound, which is interesting. Yeah. And if folks are interested in these, we have them on our Future Histories Lab website. We have talks and kind of examples of these other kinds of storytelling.
Yeah.
You've talked a lot about bodies, and I really appreciate that you've talked about your own body today. But your storytelling is about bodies in place. So are you never gonna go to some virtual, thing?
We are, for the first time, going to be talking about the future of the walking tour after 10 years of doing it to discuss some of that. But I think for us, if you look at all of our goals, they are about connecting with people and connecting with community members and helping the folks who come on our tour who may not have an organizing home sort of find that, of experiencing stories together. Sometimes we have folks who like we had one friend who came out on the first time she felt comfortable in a South Asian audience saying that she was queer, right? So it's moments like that, I think, that you cannot have unless you're with a community of people and sort of feeding off of each other's energy and feeling a sense of safety and curiosity. And also when you're walking the city, when Anirvan does the Kartar Singh Sarabha piece of that obviously Sarabha didn't die in Berkeley. He died all the way in India. But, if you walk by that location, hopefully you see his performance happening on those steps, and Berkeley becomes a very different city for you. So I think technologies, especially I think audio technology, has a lot of potential. I love where you can, map stuff out. I would love to see something where we can see Sarabha or Kala Bagai walking on the streets of Berkeley and what they might have seen around them. But right now, the tour hits all of our goals of the whole experience that we're trying to create, which is not this stand, learn, leave, but stand, learn, become, right? And we haven't found a way with tech to kind of do that. It even feels odd sharing some of this in this space, right? Because I'm like out on the street, it's loud, we're yelling, it's all good. It's, yeah.
I have a question. Where do you feel you are in your identity as an artist, and what might we see from you next?
Good question. I only started calling myself an artist, I think, on the day of the orange sky, because I'm like, what is this thing where you get up, it feels apocalyptic, and all you can think about is, oh my God, what recreation am I going to do? And I think that's like an artist's brain. And so the identity is still very new to me. I do not understand the world of like professional art or what it takes to be in a museum or be seen as an artist by other people. Do I feel like I'm creative and I'm an artist and I'm doing something of value? Absolutely. I've been telling myself that every day, because as brown women, we often have imposter syndrome of, is this valuable or not? But I think I'm also keeping myself, let me do something about that.
Do
I'm
you
also,
want it up still?
or we can just close it. Yeah. I think I'm trying to figure out sort of my own journey and being open to the opportunities that have been coming to me. Most of it has been because of wonderful people who are seeing you and seeing the work and wanting to share it with people. And I believe that's the best way, really, to sort of move this work forward. I do have in my head, more of these flowery creations. I did a calendar last year that people were really excited about. I never wanted to print things. I never even knew people use calendars, but they do. And they love giving it as gifts. I'm going to do another calendar this year. So I'm trying to balance this sort of high art and then also being very accessible to community members and sort of bringing joy. So, yeah.
Oh, I've been reading a lot about tea lately. So could you talk about tea as a plant and tea as a culture?
Oh, you want me to say something about that?
Yeah.
Oh, tea as a plant and tea as a culture. Tea, the thing I've been looking at is the history of cotton, because cotton encapsulates a lot of the history of empire and also connects what happened here in the US with slavery and cotton and the British Empire and mills and all of that. So to me, cotton is fascinating for me. But of course, tea, chai, not chai tea latte, just chai. It's an incredible part of South Asian culture, right? It's over the pandemic, I did a thing that I would not share usually, which is I found this chai that comes in a packet. Did my mic just go off? Yeah, so I found this tea that comes in a packet that you just add water, and you have it, and it was delicious. It was like a hug. But I think tea leaves, tea similarly to cotton. There's a lot of history embedded in the way tea became so popular. In India, right? And a lot of that has to do with the British Empire. A lot of we drink tea very differently. The kind of tea leaves you use that you get on the street corner are sort of the remnants. That's where sort of chai came from in some ways, is to make good use of not the most high quality leaves. So like the powder from leaves that you get. That's the tea I love. But I also love the more like British tea where it's so like refined and all of that. But when I think about tea, I think mostly about the workers, right? There's a lot of violence that happens in tea estates, and many people have written about tea already. So I will leave it at that. But I'll just say tea, cotton, and spices obviously are not just the things that we experience today. They carry a lot of history in the way we experience it. And I will say tea, though, is what's interesting about it is it feels so part of South Asian culture, but was something that was introduced that we made our own. So, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Alrighty, we have another question from the Zoom audience, and comes with a little backstory and then a question. This is from Christina, and they say, "Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I am part of their Eureka Chinatown project. We've been offering walking tours of Eureka and other place-based education efforts to tell the story of the 1885 expulsion of the Chinese residents, as well as the story of Chinese American resistance." And so their question is, can you say more about how to balance the stories of oppression and resistance?
I think for us, it's very hard to just tell stories of oppression. For us, it's been really hard. So we worked to do the kind of research that allows you to even see, as long as there's been oppression, there's been resistance. I'll say that. It may not be visible to us. It may be small acts. Even the act of survival is an act of resistance. So I don't necessarily see them as separate. I think it's how we in our community, how we do that research, and how we elevate the stories of even the smallest acts of resistance, right? And that's what we've done with the walking tour. In some cases, the act of resistance, like for Kala Bagai, for instance, is just living her life. For us, even if she didn't go on to become a community builder, just the fact that she survived and she was one of these few women in those early days is an act of resistance, that she was this person supporting organizers or activism from behind the scenes is an act of resistance. So that's how we see it. We find it really hard to just leave people with this horrible thing happened to our community. No, we've always resisted. We just have to make sure we include those stories in the telling of them. Sometimes the way we were taught stories can get in the way of us looking at our own communities. And we don't believe that we have these stories. But so far, we've always been able to find that balance and tell sort of both sides of it. So.
Well, we need to wrap up now, but I'd just like to ask one last thing, and that is, do you have any advice, especially for the students in the audience who may have stories or want to discover stories to tell in their own neighborhoods, in their own lives? Where to start? How to get going?
I guess it depends on your cultural background. I think stories have been part of many of our cultures, right? So depending on your relationship with your family, you could start at home, right? You could ask your mother or your grandmother or your grandfather, whoever you have around you, to tell you a story that they haven't shared before. If you don't have that relationship, then archives are a great place to get started. A lot of archives are now online, so they're much more accessible. You don't have to go to a dusty basement and look through stuff to find some of these gems of what's happening in the community. The newspaper archives are online. Anirvan does a lot of this work. Ancestry.com is an amazing resource because they have genealogical information that's available for free. So if you're interested in your own family histories, if you were lucky to be documented or unlucky to be documented, I should say that, a lot of our histories come from carceral documents of people being, like we have all these images of people, South Asian people in the early days, in the early 1910s at San Quentin prison, for instance, right? We wouldn't know of their presence here if it weren't for them being at San Quentin. So sometimes it takes you down dark paths. But the archives are much more accessible now. UC Berkeley I did a lot of my research for the Gather story at the Bancroft Archive, which is free to the public, obviously accessible to students. So I would start with that. Old newspapers are so fun. They're so fun to read. I mean, fun, in the way that They're ridiculous, but they're also fun. It's also surprising how some things have not changed. I think our reaction to things have changed as our numbers have grown, especially in the South Asian community. The way we respond to things have changed. But it's always fascinating to look at an old newspaper. And you can try to share it at a dinner party, but maybe an open mic might be better. We tried to share Kartar Singh Saraba's story, the young teen who came here when he was 16, got involved in the Ghadar Party, was hung to death by the British at 19. Somehow, that's very hard to share at a dinner party. And a lot of our stories do have a dark and a darkness and a heaviness. And so they need to be sort of respected in the way you share them. And so, yeah, create forums for yourself to share the story. And of course, social media is always a good place to share things as you're finding them. So.
Yeah, thanks, Barnali. And just on social media, if folks don't follow the Zin Education Project on Instagram, I learn something all the time, and that's kind of nugget, sized pieces of history. And it's, I think, an interesting example of how images and words can go together. And I want to put in a plug for Dusty Basement Archives, as well as the digital archives. I love the smell of old papers and old books and newspapers. They are fun to touch and feel, but the availability of the online archives is amazing. And I want to let both students and the public know that if you go to futurehistories.berkeley.edu, we have a whole research guide section that has links to archives and research guides and people who can help you research your family history. So please take advantage of that. So, go ahead.
I just want to invite folks to come on the walking tour. We do them every month. You can look up Berkeley South Asian. Tickets for students, early bird tickets are only $10. And I have my art up, some of these images of flowers up in the San Ramon Community Center, which is great because we get too stuck in Berkeley, San Francisco, Oakland. As part of a group show that was curated by Inner Eye. That's going to be up until the end of the month. And then I'm going to have some pieces. Well, I'm having my own art show in a gallery that's only 3 inches tall. That's up in the Berkeley Hills. It's called Art and Lit. And that's going to go up on November 6th. And for the first time, I'm going to see my images with some scale models where it will make it look like the image is the same height as the observer, which I don't know when that'll ever happen for me in a gallery, a more traditional gallery.
All gallery? I don't get it.
Yeah. It's called Art and Lit.
Okay,
look it up.
We'll have to see
it's one of those pandemic things, and it's wonderful because it's so part of Berkeley, and I'm really happy to be exhibited in there.
Yeah, great. Well, folks, next week, please come hear Catherine Suniza Choi talking about her new book, Asian American Histories of the United States. And please join me in giving a really heartfelt thanks to Barnali Ghosh.